righty.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you especially to all of you who are here for our last in our 12-week series of Vision Forums. And today, it's a particularly important topic to conclude on with a great speaker, because he's going to be talking about our school system, Montgomery County Public School System, diversity in education. And in preparing for this session and in talking to our speaker, Dr. Jack Smith, I heard so many of the themes that we have heard in previous forums repeated about the increasing diversity in the school system, about the challenges of more students in poverty, surging enrollment, budget shortfalls, kids facing hunger. One of the statistics he mentioned that was most shocking to me was that 45% of the kids in the school system, if you looked at it from the perspective of have they ever qualified for the free and reduced meal program, 45% of the kids in our public school system have. So many of the themes that we've talked about are going to be crystallized in this discussion today of the school population and our children. And the speaker we have with us, Dr. Jack Smith, is a talented and lifelong educator. He spent over 35 years in education as a teacher, as a principal, as a curriculum director, and as a school superintendent at the local level. He spent a number of years superintendent of Calvert County, Southern Maryland school system. And he spent time overseas as well. He was the principal of the Christian Academy in Tokyo in the 90s and helped to establish an international school in Bangkok, Thailand as well. And he assumed his current and very challenging position as superintendent of the Montgomery County Public Schools 6 months ago. So it's a great time to get him. He's been there long enough to have the lay of the land. And I know we'll share his thoughts on the challenges facing the school system today. So we'll do our usual model of ask you to move maybe 10, 15 minutes of background, and then we'll have a conversation and turn to questions.
Sure.
Thank you very, very much for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. It's always fun for me to get to talk about my favorite professional topic, and that is school. I spent all of my adult life in school, and so it's what I know about, think about, and care about. It's also particularly fun when I first was named to this position, Wendy Sauer Vincente, is that the right pronunciation, Wendy? Contacted me and said, hey, I know you. You were my teacher and principal in Richland, Washington. Would you like to come visit our church? We're doing a series. And so, Wendy, thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to see you again. Wendy and her sister, Christy, were great students and really watched our kids and did all sorts of things in our community, in our school, and around our kids. So it's a pleasure to be here with you today. So the questions that I was sent are the following. What are the current realities of the community? What are some of the underlying causes? Who's affected? And where are they? I assume that means in the community. How does this impact the overall health of the community? And I'll think of that word health differently than our physical well-being. What is already being done to address the circumstance? And what needs may be appropriate for the church to address? So first, we'll talk about all of those things during the next 50 minutes. But first, I'd just like to give you some background as a newcomer to this school system and this community and a way of thinking about it. I gave you some statistics and some demographics on an infographic sheet here, just because I think it's interesting. Some of you may be well aware of these numbers and ways of looking at the school system. I'm sure some of you are not, and you might find them interesting. But since coming to Montgomery County, and I will tell you, for the 3 years before I came to Montgomery County, I was the chief academic officer for the Maryland State Department of Education. And then I was the interim state superintendent for the past year. So last year I was the interim state superintendent for Maryland State Department of Education. And I tell you that because it allowed me to visit over 3 years all 24 school systems many times, including Montgomery County, to look at the state information, the state data, to look at the state of the state, and work on it. It was an interesting time because, of course, during that time there were lots of initiatives coming out of the United States Department of Education, lots of efforts, lots of ways of thinking about students and children, and some of those I think have real promise, and some of them are kind of a disaster. And that's what happens But one thing that I noticed in the state as we look at the state is the changing nature of the students we serve, the factors that we look at as we serve our students. And I also noticed before I came to Montgomery County that Montgomery County was a microcosm of that change in the state. In some ways, Montgomery County is more advanced in this accelerated change, and in some ways it's less, but it is very similar to what's happening across much of the state in many different ways. And I also knew before I came here, contrary to popular opinion, all of the streets in Montgomery County are not paved with gold.
Yeah.
And I will tell you that's how it's perceived outside, but having been at the General Assembly through the last 3 sessions a lot, there's a lot of conversation around many different aspects, but what we have is a growing population of students who come to school, and we've always had students who come to school, and the students are not the problem, no matter their circumstance, no matter their background, their education, their parents' education. They are not the problem. We've always had students come to school who were fully ready to learn as preschoolers or kindergartners, and we've always had students who were not ready to learn. Because as many of you know, what happens in the brain between 0 and 5 is profound in the structure of the brain. And as you prepare to enter into the very unnatural acts of reading and writing and doing arithmetic, people, I mean, you may say, well, my child just figured out how to read when he was 3 or 2. Well, the reason he figured out how to read when he was 3 or 2 is because he was surrounded by reading. Not just you reading books to him or her, but surrounded by literacy activities. So if there were no literacy activities, as there are in some societies still on Earth, and as there were none for centuries and millennia before that, then they wouldn't learn to read, because reading is not a natural activity. And writing, so if you can think about coming from a home that is filled with print, that is filled with digital information, that is filled with conversation at a more complex level versus not. And I think this is much of what was threaded through the sermon this morning, and what I think you've been talking about for these many weeks of this session. So as I came into Montgomery County, I observed some things that relate to how children come to school. The first thing is, and you may groan when I say this, depending on your own individual experience, but I saw this when I was at the state. I see it even more closely now. There's a very strong organizational effectiveness in Montgomery County Public Schools. That is not an advertisement for Montgomery County Public Schools. If you lose that infrastructure, 1,287 buses run, 23,000 plus employees get paid every other Friday, lunches get served, the heat comes on by and large, the air conditioning, believe it or not, comes on by and large, as it should. The teachers show up, substitutes come in when a teacher is gone. There's a principal serving in every school. All of that organizational effectiveness allows teaching and learning to happen. When you lose that organizational effectiveness, no one thinks about teaching and learning. Think about it for a minute. I won't name any school districts, but think about the ones you read in the Washington Post, read about in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, in any of the other newspapers across the nation. School systems that are struggling at the foundational level with the organization of the schools and school buildings aren't focused on teaching and learning. So it's the first observation I make. The second observation I would make is that Montgomery County, obviously, you know this better than I. Many of you have children in the system. You've had children go through the system. You may be engaged in the system yourself. I met a couple of people out in the congregation at the end of the service who said to me, "Hi, nice to meet you. We're your employees." With 23,000 people, I won't ever know all of the employees, which makes me kind of sad, because I like to know the people with whom I work and know them by name. I have 204 flashcards for every school with every principal's picture, name, number of years served, and the poverty rate in the school. I think I could take a test and get about 50%, maybe close to 60% correct now. I'm shooting for 100. I need to know the 204 principals by name, face, and conversation. So, the second thing I will tell you about this very large, complex system that's been here for decades is many, many, many students have done very, very well in Montgomery County for decades. For the 1900s into the 2000s. They've done very well, especially in academic preparation for college. That's been an area of real strength for the school system. So that we've got to maintain that. We absolutely fundamentally must maintain that high level of performance for so many students and make sure that every student who wants to and has a passion for it and an interest in it can walk into credit-bearing courses at Montgomery College, at University of Maryland, at Harvard, at San Diego State, I don't care where they go, that they can do that. They can walk in and earn credits and not have to go into remediation or some sort of non-credit-bearing course. Second thing, strong history of academic preparation for many students. Third point, not all. Not all students. Never. And I say that kind of bluntly, and I don't mean to sound harsh, but it's true. As the population shifts, the number of students who don't reach those highest academic levels shifts also because of what I said earlier about the brain development and the literacy preparation. And I can talk about this for hours and weeks because I'm very interested in the human brain, and I've spent a lot of time learning about the human brain and how we learn, because that's why I care about it, not as a doctor or in terms of health and medicine, but how do human beings learn? And I can speak about it, so I can speak about it professionally, I can speak about it personally. So I grew up in a dusty little town in eastern Washington State called Kennewick. And Wendy, you won't remember this because you're too young, but when I lived there, it was very small, was very white, it was very middle class. Lots of Latino people lived there in migrant purposes. And there was an area both in Richland and in Kennewick, and in Pasco, 3 cities side by side, very small towns when I was growing up, that was truly literally across the tracks. And I grew up across the tracks, first in Richland and then in Kennewick. And so when I think about my own childhood and my literacy development, looking back on it, I can't remember what happened 0 to 5, but I know what happened as I went through school. And as I went through school, no one had many expectations for me until I got into high school. And then 2 teachers said, Jack, come join this group, come do this. They invited me in. And because of them and their encouragement, I kind of accidentally went to college. And they were English teachers, and guess what I majored in? So, strong organizational effectiveness, really long history of academic preparation, especially for college for many students. Not all. Those are the 3 points I'd like to make. And so I'll stop there, and we'll go on to the second part of this session.
Okay, thank you. Please. It's a little bit of an obstacle course to get up here, but.
I'm going to go around behind.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Wouldn't be really good if I fell off the stage.
Well, thank you very much for setting the scene for the discussion today. And since you closed on that last point, not all, what can we do about the issues facing the not all? I mean, you talked about 0 to 5. That's not the school system's purview, perhaps, but you feel the ramifications of what happens in that time period. So what are the biggest issues facing that group that is in the not all category?
So we look at different factors affecting children, not so we can label them or so we can declare what their destiny might be. Rather, it helps us look at the aggregate of performance. And if you look at the aggregate of performance in Montgomery County, for example, about 90%. In 2015, it was 89.4% of the students graduated. We'll get the 2016 numbers soon. And so if you look at the aggregate, 9 out of 10, that's good. You can keep working, but that's good. But then if you disaggregate that data and you look at it, if you are, for example, a white male student in poverty in Montgomery County, you drop to almost the bottom of your chance of graduating, along with your Hispanic male peers, your African American male peers. You're at the bottom. And if you're Hispanic of any economic level or any gender, you're at the bottom. So we need students to graduate. That's the first thing. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So how do we get there? We have to fundamentally affect each classroom, because teaching and learning happen in the classroom. If we create more brochures, more banners, more acronyms, and I'm not being disrespectful, I'm really not, and adults all talk about it, kids have the same experience. We have to increase the number of classrooms. The goal is to 100%, but if we go up by 10%, up by 20%, where we're reaching every student, we will have very different results for the students who are most likely to experience struggles in school. And we know it's possible, and you all know it's possible, because we do two things when schools and classrooms reach every student. We write books or articles, and we make movies. That's what we do, folks. We've got to replicate that. We've got to have a laser-like focus on teaching and learning in the classroom. And then we have to support those teachers and principals in those school buildings with real effective supports that they need, not that I want or I think they need. And that's what it's going to take.
And if there's not a supportive family environment for whatever reason for learning, how big an impediment is that to the child in the classroom? Can it be overcome with
Absolutely. If it couldn't, I wouldn't be sitting here. And secondly, and I think more importantly, the real impediment is in the minds of the educators. Because if I believe that a child's lack of parental involvement, if I believe that a child's lack of literacy building blocks, if I believe that a child's race or culture or language or disability will prevent that child from learning, that child will not learn. We rarely get more than we expect. Now, if your children are very high performing and they say to you, you know, the teacher asked for 5 pages, but I'm going to do 7 just because I want to. That happens. It's rare. We have 5 children. Kate would have done that. Matt, Meg, no way. Andy and Peter, adopted from Bulgaria at age 7 and 9, couldn't. We get what we expect. And so we've got to have high expectations for all children.
You mentioned earlier that the school population is changing tremendously, dramatically. Could you talk a little bit about what some of the changes are and what the challenges associated with those changes are?
Sure, and when I talk about different services that we provide or students based on their race or culture, everyone always has to keep in mind that students of all races, cultures, backgrounds, languages, and special education services have performed at the highest levels. So we can't stereotype, we can't say, well, this group of students or that group of language learners are struggling. What we look at is, first of all, the distance to the standard. 95% graduation rate is the standard. Does that mean you don't look for the other 5 out of every 100? No, but you can know them by name and you can know their phone number and their parents' names when you have 5 out of 100 in a school who aren't graduating. So what we have to look at as we think about this is, what do the students in front of me need, and are we making progress at meeting the needs of every student as readers, as writers, as mathematicians, because that is the access point to every other discipline. Every other discipline in this world requires that you be able to read, write, and have mathematical and computational skill. In the world we live in, was not true necessarily even 50 years ago. It's true now. And so we have to be checking, and then we can see if that disproportionate number of Latino students or that disproportionate number of poor students are gaining ground, but we also want to raise the number of students where there are higher numbers, as in Asian and white students who do well. There's still a significant number of Asian and white students who aren't doing well. So it's about reaching the individual student and using our collective impact as educators to do that and stay focused on it every day. And we can't wait for the end of the year test. We have to know tomorrow and next week and next month. We should be right now looking at What didn't the student know in the first couple of months of the year? How do I change that before we check again during the second marking period or during the second semester? How do I change that? And the more I check every day, the more likely I am to help, the student learn to write in the way he or she needs to.
Are there increasing numbers of students living in poverty coming into the school system?
Yes. As you said earlier, almost 45% have ever received free reduced meals. Right now, about 41% of the elementary children do, and the system overall is 35%. So that's a significant difference. We have about almost 25,000 English learners. 1/3 of last year's kindergarten, so this year's first grade, and 1/3 of this year's kindergarten, of all races and cultures, are English learners. 1/3.
That's a challenge.
That language is an asset, folks. Language is a profound asset, and we have to help them acquire English, because English is the access point in this community, in this society. But having another or multiple other languages is an asset. Think what I said a minute ago about what's in the educator's mind. If I say, well, all of you children here are English learners, I don't know what I'm going to do with you. Kids know that. They know exactly what adults think, as opposed to, this is amazing. You all speak other languages, and now we're going to help you acquire English, and we're going to work really hard to do it together. If we give that message to parents and students, and we use really strong, effective instructional strategies, and we know where the students are and how they're progressing, we'll make tremendous progress.
Talking about the increasing diversity, socioeconomic diversity, and different country nationalities, ethnicities, if that's growing, then that's putting pressure on the culture of tolerance and inclusion in schools, I would imagine.
Absolutely.
And maybe you can talk a little bit about what the challenges and problems are in developing that culture of inclusion and tolerance, and maybe how a church could be involved in helping.
One of the things we have to do as a school system is make sure that all of our employees, our classroom teachers, our principals and building administrators, our bus drivers, our people who work in the central office and other areas, really understand how to be culturally proficient and culturally sensitive. Now those words get battered around a lot in the media, and I get really weary of the kinds of things that are said about that, really from all areas of the political spectrum. Because what that means is I know and understand the students sitting in front of me. I know culturally, I know based on their income level, and I don't stereotype them, but when I see something, I know that's consistent with their culture. If they don't behave consistent with their culture, that's okay, but at least I know the difference, and I can respond, and I can understand what that student brings to school. So if I know the student sitting in front of me, another area we have to really think a lot about, and there's been some work done, we have to do more, is the whole area of restorative practices, which should be really interesting to communities of believers of all faiths.
What is a restorative practice?
Restorative practice says that I as a teacher, I as a principal, I as a superintendent, understand that our goal is to keep every single student in the school. Sometimes students do things that they cannot stay in the regular comprehensive school. But up until the last 15 or 20 years, students dropped out. 1950 in this country, just over 50% of all students graduated from high school. So now we're up in the 80s as a nation. It's necessary, but not sufficient. A high school diploma is not sufficient if it doesn't give you skills and knowledge to walk into the workforce, walk into a really beneficial life. But we had disposable students in high school for a long time. Neither of my parents graduated from high school. And now we're saying everyone has to be in school, and everyone has to gain and benefit from the experience of school. So we have to think differently about it. So, a few times, I know Wendy would not be shocked to hear this, I might have been called a bad name at Hanford Secondary School in Richland, Washington by a student. I could tell you a funny story right now if we had the time about that. So what that says, is the student does that, then do I absolutely respond to the student, work with the student, ask the principal or the counselor to work with the student. I also need to invite the student back in. I can't say, okay, you're done. I'm not teaching you anymore because you insulted me or you offended me. We've got to absolutely find effective ways to keep all students in school. It's good for all of your children, it's good for all of the children, it's good for the society if they all find some level of success in school. The third thing is we've got to be more focused on really highly effective, high leverage instructional practices. Public education has been a kind of choose your own adventure. Wherever you go to school, you might get a degree and then an ed certificate, you might get an ed degree, you might be a generalist as an elementary teacher. I worked a lot at the state and I continue to work with the university systems and independent colleges in Maryland. We've got to really focus in a more medical model on what instructional strategies work and which ones don't. And your kids have told you, and you know from your own experience in school, the vast range of instructional practice. If we work with our adults in those three ways in an integrated way, we'll see a difference in what happens in more and more classrooms. In a lot of classrooms, it already happens really well. Intuitively or because of the training they've gotten, teachers do it. We need all classrooms to be that way, not just some.
So you've been an educator for many years. Can you comment on the teaching profession and what you're seeing in terms of the people that are coming into the field and meeting the challenges that you're outlining?
The teachers who are coming into the field today, of course, obviously are much more tech savvy. And younger teachers can relate well to the students they're serving as they come in because they have that in common. At the same time, we've gotten narrower and narrower in what the teachers come in with. So the idea that you have to have a set of broad general knowledge in your head to be a teacher. Because in that teachable moment, you can't say in an English class, well, I don't know anything about history. When a student asks you, well, when this was written, what were people thinking? You have to be ready to say, well, when this was written in 1641, this country had been in place for, these colonies had been in place for about 20 years, and these were the reasons people came. You just have to be ready to do that. Because of the narrowing of disciplines, I think we're losing some of that, and I really want the teacher preparation programs in Maryland to think more about that. I also want them to think about cultural sensitivity and restorative practices, and the instructional strategies that we know work. If you look at Deborah Ball's work at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor around 19 high leverage practices, she has done the best work, I think, in this nation around this topic. Charlotte Danielson has 96 of them. That's what the U.S. Department of Ed suggested we use for teacher evaluation during Race to the Top. It's nonsense. Who remembers 96 things in a framework in their head? Deborah Ball has 19 that make sense in the progression, and they do change the experience of students in school and the levels of learning.
Can you give us an example?
Sure, questioning strategies and discussion strategies with students. How to include all students but do it in a respectful way. How to respond to them. For example, if every time you give a response as a student, I parrot back to you what you say, the students will quickly understand that that's my system as a teacher. You all know that. That is not effective for learning. It's so much better if I ask a follow-up question, or if I ask you to explain that to your neighbor, or I ask you, could you say that one more time so the whole class can hear you clearly, and can you give me a couple of more reasons why you think that's true? Just those simple things. Or if I ask you a question and 8 of you say the answer and the other 12 are asleep, and I don't pay attention to that, or just looking out the window or talking to one another. I've got to know what my students are doing and thinking and working on every minute of every class period. And we've got to be more consistent in that as a profession. And as well as we do in Montgomery County, we've got to be more consistent in that.
Are there gender issues that you need to address?
Boys are struggling to find success in school.
Boys are struggling.
Yes, if you're doing great and with your boys, I'm telling you big numbers. Many more boys drop out. Many boys need remediation. Many more boys end up in special education. Girls have made tremendous gains in the sciences and mathematics areas, but there's still some discrepancy there. If you go to a high school graduation these days, you'll see a much more equitable, gender-represented group of students at the top of the class. So that's good news. But we're struggling with boys and keeping them engaged and doing it in a thoughtful way. And if you look at our teaching corps in Montgomery County, about 13,000 or 12,000 classroom teachers, 75% of them are white female. I have nothing against white females. I happen to be married to one right back there.
Right.
She's a great math teacher, by the way. Outstanding.
And I erred in not introducing Gail, so Gail, welcome.
But students need to have staff members around them, teachers, front office staff, principals, superintendents, directors, all the different jobs in a big complex like this system who look like them, who come from their background, who can speak authentically about how they got to where they are. That's role models and mentors and ways.
So you think that's one of the main reasons that the
got
boys
to
are
work on
struggling?
that. I do. I think we've got to pay more attention to that. And we need all genders, all races, all different kinds of people in public education so children see that.
Can we talk a little bit about ways that a congregation like ours might get involved with a school or with the school system or with an issue? Something you've experienced with
Sure.
others, and you told me about the newsletter you're planning to do, and I think people would like to hear about
We're
that.
going to do a monthly newsletter that we're going to send to every congregation digitally every month, and then we'll do one if there's like I would have done one a few weeks ago if we'd had it in place with a message on it about the way people were responding to the students and people were responding to the election. I would have done one then, and we did other things, but we're going to add this to the repertoire, and we're going to send it to every church, and they can either print it off and put it in their bulletin, they can send it out digitally, they can do whatever they want with it. But it'll be a way to reach out to all the faith-based organizations in the county. And I think there are a couple of things, and in fact, I'm going to go back. You spurred a real thought when we were talking on the phone the other day that I think might work. We have 133 elementary schools. They ranged last year from 1.7% poverty, and that's a imperfect number. It's based on the qualification for free and reduced meals, but it's an indicator, and it's an apples to apples comparison. So it's where we are, but it does tell us a lot, even though it doesn't tell us everything. So 1.7% poverty at our lowest elementary poverty school to just over 90%.
Wow, that's diversity.
And we have about 30, low 30s elementary schools who are over 65%. So the 133, about 25% of them are over 65% poverty. Mm-hmm. We have a somewhat larger group that are 35 to 65% poverty. And we staff those schools differently. So if you're in a low poverty school, you get all of the regular staffing and the guidelines. If you're in a mid-range, 35 to 65, and those are just guidelines, we add significant more staff. And if you're in a school that has high levels of poverty, over 65%, you're going to get essentially 150% of the staffing that the school allows. So when I was talking with you, I got so excited thinking about this the next day. One of the problems, and one of the things I hear from individuals, and I heard from you, is how do we help? Well, sometimes school buildings adopt organizations adopt school buildings, or schools actually adopt schools. When I go to different communities, sometimes I hear that people are thankful for that, and sometimes I hear that they're not particularly excited about it, because depending on the way it's done, you can have the best intentions in the world, but the receiver has his or her own perceptions of that. Understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So it occurred to me, we have this fantastic county council of PTAs. So we could easily build a mechanism that faith-based organizations, nonprofits, other people who really want to help schools could contribute money to that organization, which represents all the schools in the system. I mean, we have the best parent system I've ever seen in this nation, read about, anything. And then they could distribute it in a kind of dispassionate, objective way. So it's coming from the PTA council, not, Joe Brown saying to Jack Smith, I notice you're not buying a lot of food, so here, let me help you out. Which I may say, oh, I'm so thankful, or I may say, I'm just fine, thank you. I don't need help. And that's okay. Either response is okay. It's just who we are as people. So that's one way. Another way is I heard a compelling story the other night. Thursday night we had a board meeting with the board and about 40 students. And a young woman who goes to Walter Johnson, right down the road, she talked about being a first-time college attender. She talked about her anxieties and her fears as a ninth grader going into Walter Johnson. She talked about her family and the absolute lack of schema in their family about going to college. And what a profound difference it made to her, because a person came into the school and she was introduced to this person, and this is a program they have at Walter Johnson and a few other schools. And this person said to her, so I can help you navigate this world if you want to do this. If you want to do something else, you want to go into a career pathway, I can help you do that. What is it you want to do? And she said, well, I really want to go to college. So she's in the middle of her senior year right now. She said the last 2 years have been amazing to simply have someone that she meets with on a regular basis to help her navigate that world. So if you remember the story I told you at the beginning about 2 English teachers, they didn't sign me up for the SAT, they didn't take me on a college visit. What they did is they talked to me about my potential, about what was possible, about how it worked. And you can call it fate or providence or luck, bumped into Ann Clark and Art Fuller. I think we should have that happen on purpose across 25 high schools, across 39 middle schools, where we have people who can go in and be available and reach out. We're doing a program right now called Equal Opportunity Schools, and it'll take a while to explain to you, but it basically looks at potential and then who gets into the most rigorous college prep classes. And across 18 of our schools, between 100 and more than 200 students who are fully ready with support to go into the most rigorous classes don't go into them. So we did a survey, or the Equal Opportunity Schools folks did a survey across those 4 schools. 77% was the lowest return we had on the kids who we've identified as being ready but not included. 77% was the lowest in the 4 schools of kids saying the number one thing that could change my experience is having an adult invite me in and express confidence that I can and will be successful. I predict you have a lot of people in this church who could be those sorts of people in area high schools. And I told you about the young woman from Walter Johnson on purpose because that's in your neighborhood. But across the 25 high schools, there are larger numbers of students in her circumstance in other schools. So it doesn't matter which school you go to. It doesn't matter if you go to Damascus or Whitman, Churchill or Clarksburg, Paint Branch or Springbrook. There are students in every one of them who need that sort of invitation and confidence from an adult who really understands. Because you know, it was one thing for my mother to say, well, Jack, you can do whatever you want when I was in 9th grade. It's another for Art Fuller to say, come on, Jack, you can do this, and I will help you. And he did. And I had the chance to tell him that before he passed away.
Well,
so
that's powerful, and you're echoing some things we'd heard from a mentor, a panel on mentoring. So I think that reinforces some of those themes. It's time to turn to the audience for questions. So John has the microphone. Questions?
Anybody have any questions?
Thanks. Just to follow up on that last point about mentorship, how do the schools set that system up? So let's say it's a group of 10 people from St. John's that want to do this in a high school starting next fall. Is there an individual at each of these high schools, or say a particular high school, that would coordinate all of this and make time? And finding time in a high school kid's day for something like this is not academic or athletic, is maybe a luxury in a way. But so is there systems set up for that?
there are systems set up in all of them. One of my concerns would be that a group would reach out and bump into the wrong person on the wrong day who would be grumpy or indifferent and say, well, we'll get back to you, and never get a call back. And so my message, and in fact now I've decided I'm going to put this in the first newsletter we send out to all faith-based organizations, we'll give a name and a number of a person that can help you navigate that, because in a big system, you know, I have to tell you, as a principal for many, many years, more than once, and in this role, in the state role, have I been unhappy to hear later on that someone reached out and wanted to help, and the person they happened to bump into with that first phone call or that first visit was indifferent or having a bad day or truly didn't care. That's a sad reality, but there are a few people, not many, but there are a few people who just don't care, and they'll just, another do-gooder, another person who, I don't have time for this, I have all my stuff to do. So we'll provide that because I think that's a really great untapped resource. So in that first newsletter that we send out in January, we'll have a name of a person who will help connect groups to schools based on the group's interest and the school's interest.
That's great, fantastic.
Jack, we've been around for 140 years. Ulysses S. Grant was president. We have been through these shifting demographic changes of Bethesda when it moved from an rural population and suburbanized and urbanized, and we were there for World War I veterans and World War II veterans in the 60s when momentous things were happening. And we're in this process now of really figuring out, okay, where are we really, our skill sets and what we can contribute. Looking at, and I wanted you to comment, you said something that struck me, things are changing demographically, for instance, in this county more quickly than anybody had ever imagined. Mm-hmm. We also want to look out not just what the needs are tomorrow or the next year or two, but really set up a base from which we can really begin to take a leadership role over the next 10 or 15 years. So I wanted to comment about where are we moving in all of this, in these changing demographics, and where is that going to lead us as a county and as a microcosm of a nation? Big question, but I think it's...
What are the longer term challenges?
I think a couple of the things that I would point to in my response that I think are going to be significant. Montgomery County's high level of success with many, many students that I referenced earlier, as I said, was mostly in college preparatory work, because that was what most of the people here, that was their reality. Many of them had gone to college or become successful in business, through different avenues. I think one of the things we have to do is build more career pathways for students in the county. Not so we can say, well, the well-to-do families or the children with parents who went to college can go to college, and the ones who are not so well-to-do, they can go to career pathways. That's the old vocational model. We have to change to a model that says our society needs lots of different individuals in it as workers. What is it you want to do? And we're going to make sure you're well prepared for that as you walk out the door with a diploma. And then we're not going to say, if you don't want to go to College Park in August after graduating in June, that you're a failure. We've got to change that mindset, folks. And I think groups like this need to embrace that idea and help spread that message, because we have so many students who go to college in this country, they run up debt or they spend a lot of their family's resources, and then they don't finish because it isn't what they want to do. It isn't how they see the world, and it doesn't mean they're failures. Or you can be my son Matt, who has a private college education. We spent a lot of money. He spent a lot of money. He still has debt. He has a degree in sociology and psychology, a double major. He now works at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab as a security network specialist. I'm not sure what that is. So what do you think his degree has to do with what he's doing? Now, his degree has value. It stands alone in its own value. But if you ask Matt, if I were to live my life over, what would I do differently? He would say, I would like to have known earlier what I was really good at and I cared about. So I think we have to change that mindset. Along with that, we have 5 high schools. There's been a lot of talk about Walter Johnson. Add to it Einstein, Blair, Springbrook, Northwood. Is that 5? Yeah, I think it's 5. 600 students over capacity in the next 5 years. And Kennedy will be 300 students over capacity. We have to rethink the options we give kids at high school. If kids want to go through a regular high school traditional model, be in the marching band, be on the soccer team, take AP classes, we have more than enough students and more than enough classrooms to maintain that, and we should and we need to. But sometimes students want to do different things, and we have to provide spaces for them to do that. Like in the 11th grade, students who are really like, this is where Matt would have gone if he had had the chance, to a different kind of program, maybe in an office building, and really looked at computing and computers, because what he likes. I said to Matt, after he got into this field a few years ago at Washington International School as a network manager, and then he became the director of technology for the Key School in Annapolis for a few years. I said, Matt, how did you learn all this? He said, do you remember you gave me that book, Computer Science for Dummies, when I was in the 10th grade? It's absolutely true. It's what he told me. I read it. I said, wow, well, you've done okay with reading it. I think we need to start earlier for them to have those opportunities. Not to, if your child wants the traditional experience and walks off and goes to UVA or Montgomery College or University of Connecticut, that's wonderful. If your child wants something different and sees the world differently, we have more than enough students to provide the spaces for that to happen. So I think we also have to really engage in a really dynamic and good conversation about that, because we have a lot of students coming and we need to meet their needs, and we have more than enough spaces and ways of doing that if we're willing to shift a little bit from what has been. But we all live in the trap. That's the way we've always done it. This is how I went through high school. High school was wonderful. I loved every minute of it. I can't imagine depriving my child of that. My child needs what I had. That is a trap, folks. See, one of the things that's interesting about me, I didn't love every minute of high school. It wasn't particularly comfortable or wonderful. I had some very bright spots in it. My wife, great student. She was typical. She, very different backgrounds and experiences. Both are valuable, both matter. So I think we have to think differently.
Meredith?
I can't believe you've just been with the school system since, our school system since July. I'm just blown away with your knowledge of the educational system. I'm in the early childhood area, early Head Start and some other programs. And so I was delighted to hear you talk about early childhood learning experiences straight on. Something that Montgomery County doesn't have a very good reputation, though, is working with parenting teens. And as you were talking about kids who drop out of school, one of the big groups of that is parenting teens. And although the birth rate for teens has dropped a good deal in the last couple of years, it hasn't especially with Latino girls. So I'm wondering what your take is on that for Montgomery County, and are there any other programs that might get established to assist parenting teens not drop out?
Well, it goes back to something I said earlier, and that is restorative practices. The idea that we keep every student in school and we help them see themselves as being successful and moving toward what they want. And I think as we change mindsets around that, then we will do a much better job with students who find themselves in that circumstance. There's a lot of holdover in our society, and this is not at all any sort of political or moral statement that I'm making. Regardless of what anyone thinks about that, we still need that student, and that student still needs to grow up and go out into the community and have options and choices and be a contributor and benefit from the society. And when they drop out or get a substandard experience in high school because they find themselves with a child, then we have failed, utterly failed. So we have to change the mindset around keeping everyone in school and meeting their needs to get where they want to go, not where we think they belong. We really do, and that's going to be the secret to that, is how we provide adult learning around those principles and those ways of thinking.
think we have time for another one or two questions.
Hi, I'd like to hear more about the disparate poverty levels in the schools, because I know from experience with my kids in the school system how different the experience can be based on the PTA's resources, the schools that have their separate foundations that provide enriched learning experiences. I would love it if we could have more equity amongst all the schools in terms of financial resources. And I know that measuring the farms rate is one way of tracking. I also feel like the level of wealth beyond middle class, like that disparity, is huge and can make a big difference in people's experience and should also be tracked in some way. Anyway, I'd like to hear more if you think that's an important thing for us to try to make more even and fair. What your thoughts are about that, and what direction we're heading in with that.
There's a lot of conversation around this just even since I've been here. I've been in many conversations, and I do think when you look at those poverty levels, then the ability of the adults in the community to support that school is in direct proportion to the wealth. I would work on the bottom end of that equation. I think the top end is not a good use of our time. I don't think we should ever make people feel guilty or uncomfortable or like somehow or another we're judging them because they have been economically successful. I don't think it's a good use of time. Thornton Wilder wrote in one of his plays that the difference between a great deal of money and a little bit of money is very small. But the difference between a little bit of money and no money at all can fracture the world. That's an approximation of that quote. So I think we have to get schools to a threshold where that there is some level of equity, and then beyond that, we can't be responsible for the school system, and the community can certainly talk about it, but a whole lot of people will agree and a whole lot of people resist that conversation about what happens when there's a great deal more money in a community than a community 5 miles away. But we can do more to meet a threshold of opportunity in all 133 elementaries, all 39 middles, and all 25 high schools. And I think just the idea that Ann gave me on the phone of getting an infrastructure so that money could be gathered and then dispersed in a dispassionate way will help. Because I can tell you, many of your colleagues, I don't know about sitting in this room, but 1,040,000 people live here right now, will not be particularly happy if I say, well, let's take the money from school X and give it to school Y, because they'll say, what am I getting for my 9% tax increase last year? So we have to be really sensitive to that. We do. We have to think about it, but there are ways to get to a threshold of opportunity for all of the elementary, all the middle, and all the high school. And I think we have to push on that every day, because that's common good. That's good for us all, no matter who we are, where we live, or what our resources are.
Sarah, did you have a question? Okay, well, then let me thank you so much for so eloquently outlining the challenges and some solutions. Thank you. It's really great. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.